anthropology, and Black and Latinx studies in order to interrogate the intersections of language, race, and identity. Originally from all over the Bay Area in California, she has been steeped in the traditions of anti-racist pedagogies and has dedicated herself to developing and sustaining these practices in her own research and teaching. As such, her research agenda is rooted in social change through an examination of the ways that what appears to be common knowledge is often constructed and ideologically maintained by various social institutions. She was the recipient of a Spencer Doctoral Fellowship, which allowed her to complete research surrounding Dominican language and identity in digital and educational spaces. Excuse me. Aris has recently been awarded a Department of Education grant, a Humanities Fellowship, and an ACLS to continue her exploration of Black Spanishes in the U.S. classroom and media spaces. Overarchingly, Aris questions the linguistic mechanisms, repetitions, stance-taking, tropicalizations, etc., responsible for the reconstruction and maintenance of racialization and marginalizing ideologies. Welcome, Aris.
Thank you so much for the introduction.
So now I am glad to introduce you Arthur K. Spears. Is Presidential Professor at the City University of New York. He is affiliated with 2 units of CUNY, the City College Anthropology Department and the Graduate Center, where he is in both the linguistics and the anthropology programs. Spears' research spans linguistic, anthropology, sociology, sociolinguistics, Pidgin Creoles, and language contact, grammatical analysis, race and ethnicity, education, and ideology. The languages he specializes in are African American English and Haitian Creole, along with other French-related Creoles languages. He works in 4 languages, English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese, and is one of the few individuals ever to have passed the U.S. State Department's contract interpreter examination in 4 languages. Welcome, Arthur.
Next, it is my pleasure to introduce Eva Michelle Wheeler. Eva Michelle Wheeler is the Associate Professor of Spanish and Black Studies at Providence College. Her work in sociocultural linguistics positions language as a lens for interdisciplinary analysis of complex social constructs such as race, beauty, cultural otherness, and diasporic positionalities. She is the author of articles that have appeared in journals such as the Black Scholar, Sociolinguistic Studies, International Review of Qualitative Research, Diálogo de la Lengua, and Latin American and Caribbean Ethnic Studies. In addition to chapters in edited volumes published in the US and internationally. Through her methodology-driven research in diverse social, cultural, geographic, and linguistic settings, she seeks to examine social phenomena in new ways, and to give a voice in academic literature to underrepresented voices. Welcome, Dr. Wheeler.
And finally, it is my pleasure to introduce you Dr. Juan R. Valdez. Juan R. Valdez teaches at all levels of Spanish. He enjoys teaching as a way of helping students to optimally develop their communicative skills, while they also develop a critical sense of community and coexistence in a diverse and complex world. Juan is also a scholar and a writer. Until recently, his research focuses on the politics of language, paying special attention to the interplay of language and race in the construction of identity and struggles for power in the Hispanic Caribbean and the US. He has published articles, essays, and books including Tracing Dominican Identity, the writings of Pedro Enriquez Ureña in 2011, and En busca de la identidad, la obra de Pedro Enrique Sureña, in 2015. His forthcoming book, Sendas Extraviadas, que se publicará en la Universidad Autónoma de México, is a series of essays on aimless walking that explore the possibility of overcoming some of our most perilous notions of politics, race, and mental health, and also how redefining our relationship with nature strengthens our sense of place and belonging in the world. He has taught seminars as a visiting scholar in Germany, and Cuba. Welcome, Juan, and thank you.
And there is one panelist who was originally going to be part of this session who did not join us today. And I would be remiss if I did not introduce her in her absence and also share with you her statement for her decision to not participate in this event. Her name is Dr. Uju Anya. Dr. Uju Anya is a scholar of language learning and Black experiences in multilingualism, an associate professor of second language acquisition at Carnegie Mellon University, a 2023 Duolingo Research Fellow, and a 2023 Mellon Foundation's New Directions Fellow. Her primary fields of inquiry are applied linguistics, sociolinguistics, world language education, and critical discourse studies examining race, gender, sexual, and social class identities in new language learning through the multilingual journeys of African American students. In this work, she introduced to applied linguistics a critical race pedagogy for more effective anti-racist, equity-minded, and inclusive world language teaching. Dr. Anya's research is published in journal articles and in her book, Racialized Identities in Second Language Learning. Speaking Blackness in Brazil, Routledge 2017, winner of the 2019 American Association for Applied Linguistics First Book Award, recognizing a scholar whose first book represents outstanding work that makes an exceptional contribution to the field. Her other main areas of inquiry include intercultural communication, applied linguistics as a practice of social justice, strategic translanguaging in world language pedagogy, and multilingual education in the metaverse. And the following is her statement in her own words. I must preface this with Uju Anya informed us earlier this week that she would no longer be participating in today's panel, and this is the reason. I take this action in solidarity with CUNY students, faculty, and staff whose First Amendment right to freedom of speech CUNY administrators violated by utilizing government law enforcement agents to brutalize and arrest them for making their constitutionally protected speech through engagement in protest and collective action against Israel's genocide of the Palestinian people and against CUNY's financial investment, participation, and profit in the genocide through the university's fiduciary ties with the Israeli government. Manufacturers of Israelis' military weapons and providers of ancillary services. I recognize that you, the organizers of this event, are not personally responsible for your university's decision to mobilize police forces to enact violence and brutality on CUNY students, faculty, and staff in an effort to suppress their speech against genocide. However, I do not wish to contribute to any program that supports the normal functioning of CUNY events at this time or otherwise gives your university leadership the impression that regular life and work will go on as usual while they harm CUNY students, faculty, and staff. Earlier in this session, my colleague Denise shared our statement and our stance in regards to the events that transpired on April 30th and how we condemn the repression of voices, discourses, and identities by CUNY and other educational institutions. We thank you for joining us, and we hope that you'll see this space as a space in which we get to continue to have these conversations that are often repressed. And I thank you again, thank the panelists and our faculty members for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Julissa, and thank you all for your attention so far. So now we are going to start with the panel discussion. For the participants, you need to know that we share a question with our panelists. As a prompt, the question was, how do you center anti-racist language practices in your daily professional work? And with these questions, panelists are invited to offer their reflection on identity and positionality in relation to centering Blackness in Hispanic sociolinguistics. So now we are going to hear what the panelist wants to say about this. We are going to first hear Aris, then Arthur, then Eva, and then Juan, if you agree. So, Aris, please.
Yeah, so first I just want to say again, thank you for that warm introduction of all of us and for reading that statement. It was a very difficult decision for me, and once I was hearing about these movements and having myself been standing with my students here on my campus who are having their own actions to ask for the divestment from Israeli companies here on our campus, it was a very difficult decision for me to show up. And ultimately, this kind of idea about how I center my anti-racist language practices and how I center kind of the liberatory frames and linguistic justice in my work was the decision that made me show up. And I wanted to start by just kind of talking a little bit about why I decided to show up amongst several people's decisions to not participate in university activities right now as we're seeing these kind of campus protests go on. But the ways that I understand how certain voices and certain people are not often given spaces to have their voices be heard, and how I recognize this space as one of those places where the kind of stories or the kinds of approaches, the kinds of epistemological stances that we take are not as popular as it may seem when we are only talking to each other. And so that being in this space is hopefully going to be one that is healing for me as I've gone through this week, and I have been watching what's going on across the country, thinking about my students who are not only at my institution, but at institutions with which I work in collaboration. And so, yeah, I just wanted to start with that. And so, in really thinking about also who I am as a person, I think in my introduction, Julissa had mentioned something about me being from all over the Bay Area. And so one of the things that I always talk about, especially when thinking about my work, as I graduated with my Ph.D. in Hispanic linguistics from a Spanish department. My name is Aris Clemons, though my parents do not speak any Spanish, and the name is not actually Spanish. And so I often have to lead with my positionality in order to kind of correct some assumptions about who I am as a person and why I enter into this work. And I think this is very important because I think it's often very easy to represent yourself as a particular thing in the academy in order to gain credence, in order to gain kind of this idea of expertise, of your voice as an expert voice in talking about particular things, when maybe your identity does or doesn't have to do with how you gained that expertise. And so I often tell people that I was born to an African-American father and a West Indian mother. She was, speaking of French Creoles, she was born in Martinique and was raised there for most of her life, and then came in her young adulthood to the United States, to California, where she met my father. And what was important about them is that when she came, my grandmother was an academic herself. Though she wasn't a professor, she was an activist. And so she was very, very involved in the kind of support of African American vernacular English, so much so that she herself can be seen in the kind of court cases of supporting Ebonics in the Oakland Ebonics debates of the 1990s. My academic, her sisters, who were her academic sisters, I call them my academic aunties, kind of shaped who I was as a person. And this is Drs. Mary Hoover and Drs. Faye McNair Knox, who were doing this kind of early research about what Black language was, what African American vernacular was, and how it was rule-based and systematic in order to empower the people who were in our communities, in order to empower people who spoke in a particular way and who had decided in divestment from local public schools because the idea that their children were not getting educated. And so when I think about my family history and how I was kind of born into this activist mindset, that really does shape the way that I think about all of my work. So I will start with just a couple of projects that I'm working on that kind of exemplify centering this anti-racist language practices. And I will also just, in terms of positionality, say that many of us, I think, who are here, and you guys can agree with me, I won't speak for everybody, but many of us are not afforded the ability to not think about our positionality or to not think about how the bodies from which our language is produced, the bodies that our messages are heard from. Many of us are just not afforded the ability to not think about those things. On another note, I center Blackness as a defining characteristic of all things that are American life, right? Blackness is a centralized concept that organizes what American life is. And when I say American, I mean hemispherically American. And that is because it is only through Blackness that we're able to structure the kind of the ideas of what is pure, of what is standard, right? Of what is good, of what is appropriate. It is through this idea of what we can't do or what is othered that allows us to have what is situated as normal. And so we cannot have whiteness without Blackness. We cannot have what is appropriate or standard without having Blackness. And so it's through Blackness, or anti-Blackness, if you want, that we are able to structure what is considered American life. And that means that we're also, at the same time, thinking about the ways that people who exist in these bodies have to move through kind of moments of self-determination and defining their own selves and defining the ways that they speak and defining the ways that they move in order to remain human, in order to kind of reclaim the humanity that's often kind of stripped from them in these practices of defining the other, of defining what is standard on the other side, right? And so I recently published a chapter in the Handbook of Decolonizing Linguistics, which is a wonderful project that I can talk about more later if anybody is interested, that was called Apolitical Linguistics Doesn't Exist and It Shouldn't. And this really came from this idea that as a linguist and being trained as a linguist, I was often kind of fed this idea that we had to do the work in a particular way for it to be, one, rigorous, and for it to be objective, right? And a lot of that way that I was trained said to remove the language from the body and kind of study the language as this disembodied phenomena that could exist outside of the body, right? You don't even have to actually speak the language to be able to analyze how it's functioning. And you certainly don't have to think about the context in which it was produced, as long as it was produced naturally. And so that really, having been raised by activists and having been so kind of situated within an understanding that context really is important, it just didn't really sit well in my spirit. And so as I really started to think about it, I was like, well, actually, there is no objective science. And I don't mean only social science. I mean, there is no objective science because in doing any kind of science, we do it from a question. And the questions are formulated by humans who have experience, who exist in a context, who exist in a world, who exist in a society. And since humans themselves are constructing the questions, then there is an impossibility and the questions themselves being free from some sort of ideology. And so thinking about that, I said, well, what is the way that we deal with the fact that there is no objective science when we're doing language studies? And I thought, well, then we have to be transparent. And so in this article, I developed this kind of concept of political transparency in linguistics work. And this is a very simple kind of edict, a very simple call to linguists and language scholars. And that call is to be transparent about your motivations for asking your questions. Be transparent about where you got your theoretical paradigms from, why you have an allegiance to those theoretical paradigms. Be transparent about how you are communicating with the people who are creating your data, right? Your participants, if you will, the communities that you are targeting in your research. How are you involving them in the design of your studies?
Aris, I don't know if you can hear us, but your camera is for, oh, you're back.
Oh no. Okay, I don't
yeah.
know where I ended off, but can you hear me now?
Yes, you're
Yeah.
back.
So basically this concept of political transparency is really being kind of transparent about your motivations for doing your work and the ways that you came to your theoretical frames, the ways that you came to your questions, and how you're involving the communities that you're focusing on in the research process, from design to implementation to reporting on those kinds of studies that you're doing. And so in the chapter, I gave an example about talking about how I approach Dominican language and how I often call Dominican language a Black language practice, regardless of who's speaking the language, right? But be they Black Dominicans or not non-Black Dominicans. And I, trust me, y'all, I have gotten pushback on calling Dominican language a Black language practice. And so I started this work by being very transparent about my motivations for doing the work, right? And my motivations for doing the work with Dominican Spanish is to kind of contest colonial frames of power that have positioned the dialect as deficient, as remedial, as something that could be remediated through education, to get them closer to these kind of hegemonic and wider varieties of Spanish. And so in thinking about contesting those colonial frames of power, it was also necessary for me to contest the methodologies by which we generally do this kind of work. And so instead of thinking about comparing Dominican Spanish to some hegemonic variety of Spanish, so i.e., null subject pronouns in Dominican Spanish versus a Castilian version of Spanish. Instead of doing that, I thought, what if I thought about Dominican Spanish through the processes and practices that speakers use and compare it to another marginalized variety of a language that is spoken by colonial subjects, and that is African Americans, right? Speaking English. And so that removes the possibility of looking at the language features and makes it so that I have to look at the practices and the processes that are happening in that language. And then through that, found that in the development of, let's say, lexical innovation, so thinking about new vocabulary, a lot of the practices are mirrored because they are a response to the society in which the speakers have to produce their language, right? So they are a response to being marginalized. They are a response to being repressed in school spaces. They are a response to formerly enslaved populations having to speak. And when you think particularly about the Dominican context, it's then not surprising that the dominant language is a Black language project, a Black if the kind of or the spoken language that people are speaking, right? And so if we're thinking about even just historically the numbers of people who would have had to speak in a particular context, it makes sense that these practices came to be part of Dominican languaging, right? And so I'll just speak for one more minute before passing it over to my colleague. But I think when we're thinking about what it means to do liberatory linguistics and what it means to center Blackness, when we're thinking about a language that doesn't often center Blackness in the understanding of how the language itself functions, both socially and linguistically, we have to really, really be intentional about centering the human, about recentering kind of the social, historical, and kind of emotional ways that people use and produce their language, and move from that space rather than from the language as the kind of centered piece. And so while we can use the tools of kind of the methodological approaches that we use to analyze language in linguistics, we must do so within an understanding of who, when, and how the language itself is being produced. And so I'll end by saying that you have to be an active listener. You have to check your own privileges while you're using the language, while you're doing the language, even when you feel like you're part of the community, right? Because we, no matter what, right, we have a level of education, we have a level of privilege by being academics, by being able to be in these spaces, by having a job that allows us to read and produce more knowledge for ourselves and for our communities. And so moving from that place of privilege, we must kind of continue to reevaluate our own positionality when doing these works, and always understand that we are a tool of the research. The research is not just done in some sort of vacuum in an objective way. Right? So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Aris, for your strong words. I think that we all are thinking and have thoughts resonating, and we can discuss more later in the Q&A moment. But now we are going to hear Arthur Spears.
Mm-hmm. Okay, this is very difficult for me for a reason you guys may not be aware of. I entered graduate school in linguistics about 55 years ago. So I had this long span of working with language. I've also been involved with teaching in various ways. A lot of people, my forebears, were teachers. I'm also the grandson of slaves. My grandparents were slaves, and that's hard to believe, but I tell people just do the math and it works. Why do I say that? It's not just because it's unusual, but it gives me a very long span. If people are talking about language teaching, the history of language teaching, I often find that's not true. You're not considering X, Y, and Z, which were done in the 40s and 50s. If they're talking about the civil rights movement, I can say, no, I was there, and what you're saying is not true. Okay. If they're talking about racism and the history of racism and segregation, I can say it's not true. I was there and I know it's not true. So it gives me a long perspective. I have so much to say, but I'm going to try to condense it into a package because we certainly want to hear everything the other speakers have to say. Okay. My connection with Spanish, I should say something. I can't remember anything I've actually written on Spanish from any aspect, but it's been a very integral part of my life, as has been French and Portuguese and Haitian Creole. I've spent a lot of time in the Dominican Republic and in Puerto Rico, in Brazil. I lived, worked, and studied in South America, in Uruguay. I studied in Chile. Same thing in French. I lived, studied, and worked in France. When I was in graduate school, I was an escort and seminar interpreter. That's simply oral translation. And I worked with French speakers, Spanish speakers, Portuguese speakers from basically all of the world except Asia, Africa, Europe, and Latin America. As an escort interpreter, I traveled around the country with them, so I got to know them very well. We had long discussions and so on and so forth. My political work, I'll call it such, has been basically outside of an academic framework. Okay. I have had what most people would see as a very, very difficult and trying career as a Black male. Okay. Many people would have probably dropped out, but I grew up under segregation, Jim Crow, lynching, all of that. So, you know, my career, all of those things are nothing. As I like to say, I've been denied tenure multiple times. I was denied every single promotion that I have ever applied for. So I'm living this long span of racism and all of those things. Let me say something about teaching foreign languages. And I've got some notes here, but I'm just going to have to pick particular points. I grew up under segregation, so we went to all Black schools, all Black teachers, principals, even the superintendent was Black. Okay. When we went off to mostly historically white colleges and universities, we quizzed out of the foreign language requirement because we were taught French and Spanish, those were the languages we had, so well that we simply quizzed out of the requirement. The same thing for math and biology and so on and so forth. And you're saying, this doesn't make sense. Segregation, Black people had nothing. We had no resources. That can't be true, that the Black schools were better than the white schools. So when you were there, you see that all of that is written. And Aris, you were talking about the objectivity of social science and so on and so forth. It's ridiculously off base. How were Spanish and French taught? The Black teachers required that we learn to speak the language. Okay, when you study Spanish, the first year you start learning to speak it. You know how to say more the second year than you know the first year, but after 2 months in that class, you are already speaking and having conversations. That's just the way it was. The thing about it, and I'm condensing this point, is that today we often talk about positionality. In the Black schools, positionality was everywhere. There were no topics that were kept outside of the classroom. Everything was in the classroom. Our Blackness, colorism, whose family was related to whose family. What are you going to expect when you go to college? So we did not have one fancy term for it nowadays is disciplinary closure. We were in French class, but we talked about everything. So when we went to college, for example, we knew exactly what was going to happen. Black culture was the foundation for teaching. There's a lot of talk now about culturally sustaining pedagogy. In the Black schools, Black culture was a given. It was the foundation. Teachers taught Blackly. That's Black with suffix "ly." They spoke standard English. They were required to, but they used it Blackly. So when I see the material that's being written today about culturally sustaining pedagogy, I say, oh, we had that in the Black schools. The tropes, the old sayings, the stories, they were all Black. So we were totally at home in the classroom. And of course, it's not the same today. I've done the same thing in my teaching. I have taught, for example, Spanish linguistics. I taught Spanish and French as a graduate student. Also, while I was a graduate student, I taught French at a private school in Washington, D.C., where I got to know Mary Hoover and Thabon Cook. So I'm so glad you mentioned them. You need to remember these scholars. I did the same thing. And when I was at City College with sociolinguistics and linguistic anthropology, those courses, I did what we did in the Black schools. And one of the tools I used in teaching, and I started this in the I started in the 70s, is I would give students basic concepts for maybe the first 2 classes. And then I would say, I want you to write your sociolinguistic autobiography. And the things that came out of them, and they would go back and revise them after we had gone over more concepts and so forth. The incredible things that I learned about Dominican Spanish, which I knew nothing about in the 80s, and Puerto Rican Spanish and Brazilian Portuguese and so on and so forth, were incredible, because that brought out everything in their lives, and it also brought their questions to the fore instead of following a textbook. When I got to classes, usually they were mostly Dominican or mostly Haitian or mostly African American. So essentially, if I was going to teach to my audience, I had to wait until the first day of class to see who was there. I might look at the list of students, but the names don't tell me exactly who they are. And I would automatically adjust the course content, supplement the course content, and do all of that so that it would fit the majority of Dominicans, say, the significant group of Puerto Ricans, the few Brazilians, and so on and so forth. And fortunately, I was able to, because I had experiences with those countries. I would wrap that part of what I want to say up with, there are new things under the sun. But it does seem that when we're talking about pedagogy, language acquisition, and so forth, there's a lot of historical circularity. And a lot of things that we're proposing now, they were done back when in certain cases. So that's what I've got to say about positionality, teaching, and so on and so forth. I could say a lot more, but I won't. I do a lot of work on race. And I should say that I believe in theory. I believe in grand theory, if you will. And it's funny because grand theory, for example, in the social sciences used to be quite important in the 50s and 60s, 70s, Foucault, Derrida, all of those people. But it strangely has fallen out of favor. The same thing with ideology. ideology is one of the most important notions that we can work with, but unfortunately, it has fallen out of favor. Okay, for various reasons. And I would say that is due to the climate of the academy, which has so many fads and which is so politicized. I have had so many colleagues tell me that I was going to lose my job. I didn't lose my job. I just kept getting turned down for promotions. And of course, I would file a grievance. You know, after a while, it becomes routine. You can do it with both hands tied behind your back. And I want to say this, because we, and I'm talking about people of color and women, tend not to talk about the horrors that we have faced in our careers. I thought I was the only one. No other Black men or women or brown men or women have gone through what I've gone through. You know what? People I've known for 40 years, it finally comes out, the horrors that they have experienced. It finally comes out. They had kept them bottled up. And of course, in class, I tell the students that, because we don't have disciplinary closure. The classroom is the world. We keep marching forward in terms of the course content, but still, our classroom is the world. I would say that's basically it. I want to say two things before I leave: science and theory. I completely agree with what Aris said. I think I know where she's coming from. But let's step back a second. What we have to remember is that science is a work in progress, always. There's good science, there's bad science, there's pseudoscience. But let's remember always that there is something called science. That's why we have cell phones and computers and automobiles and electricity. There is something called science. And there is something called the science of language. But if I may amplify what you were saying, Aris, once interests come in, and ideology and censorship, which is a mega problem in the academy, particularly in the social sciences. As Chomsky once said, the so-called hard sciences are really sciences. But in the social sciences, it's mostly ideology. So what he was saying, all of these interests and points of view and all positionalities have infected social science so bad that we need to cross out the science and just throw that in the wastebasket. But we can attack that. There's something that we can do, because we can build, and I'll call them theories, and they help us, they move us forward. Recently, for example, we had a special issue in the Journal of Linguistic Anthropology about whiteness and anti-Blackness and so on and so forth. And I argued very strongly for the study of race and colorism. There can't be a theory of race without a theory of colorism. They're just two sides of the same coin. Isn't it amazing that there are 10 billion volumes on race and they say nothing about colorism? I mean, what? How can you understand your first day in Latin America without some concept of colorism? I mean, they're part of the same theory. What was it? Personal experience. Personal experience. What and I'm going to just draw on what Aris said, all of those points that she made, you have to say, where are you coming from? You have to get feedback from the people you're working with. You have to explain. All of these things are fundamental. And I could wrap them up in personal experience. You have to bring your personal experience and that of the people that you're interacting with and working with. Bring them to theory. Bring those things to science. And keep working and make it better as we go along. Let me say something too about Black colleges today. HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. Along the way, I've had the honor and pleasure of knowing some really, really great Black educators and Latino educators, but I'll focus on the Black educators. And one of them was Mercer Cook. And I don't know if you know him. He taught French. He was a French professor and ambassador to Niger and Senegal, and did me wonderful things. But French teaching at Howard was Afro-infused. That's what they got. So that and other HBCUs had carried on that tradition from the Black K through 12 schools that I had gone through. There's a way to Blacken it. There's a way to relate it to your Black students. There's a way to bring in the Black world and its politics and its concerns, or the Latino world and its politics and its concerns into language teaching. Language teaching in no way has to be solely about phonemes and morphemes and sentence structure and tenses and so on and so forth. I'll end with one little anecdote. Like I say, there's so much to say, and even as I talk, more things are coming into my mind. I was on the Atlanta University campus one day, several HBCUs that share a campus. And I was visiting Morris Brown. I'd given a talk there. And we went to the best faculty cafeteria that I have ever been into in my life. I was stunned. The cornbread. Don't let me get into that. So as we were going to the faculty cafeteria, the French teacher and the colleague that I was with said, "Oh, that's our main French teacher. She's head of the department over there." And he knew of my involvement with French. And so she turned around and said to a student who was right near us, "Et ça." That means, and that. And the student knew exactly what she was talking about. I laughed. Why did I laugh? Because that's what the Francophone Africans say in particular situations. Et ça, when I was interpreting, something was going on, I was traveling around with people, they said, et ça, first thing at breakfast. And I said, the professor has Africanized French. She's relating it directly to the Black students at the HBCU. And that's what she's telling them. French is not solely Europe. Spanish is not solely Europe and Spain and so on and so forth. It's you. And we can make that part of the curriculum, which is obviously what we're here talking about today. I'm going to stop here. There's so much I would like to say, but I'm going to stop here. Because I certainly want to hear everything the others want to say.
So thank you, Aris and Arthur, for sharing your perspectives. I remember when I first got the notification about this panel, I posted on Facebook to my friends and family, and I said, I'm going to be standing shoulder to shoulder with intellectual giants. Like, I'm sitting on this panel with scholars whose work I've engaged whose work I respect, whose perspectives I greatly respect. And even just having listened to the first 2 segments, I even find what I was planning to say changing in my mind. Thinking about our broader socio-political context, I think the first thing that comes to my mind is just like tired. I'm tired of kind of showing up and fighting every day, whether it be on our college campuses, in broader society. I am standing in solidarity in the ways that I'm able with my colleagues and with students who are on the front lines of that fight. And as we were thinking about like what resistance looks like, what our contestation can look like in a context like this, where the institutions that employ us are also the institutions that continue to do violence to us. I thought about a unit that I do with my students in Introduction to Black Studies, and we talk about athletes and activism. And one of the examples that came to mind was the Olympic Games in Berlin under Nazi Germany, when half of the athletes decided they weren't going to show up at all. And that was their boycott, was their protest. And then thinking about Jesse Owens and Frank Robinson and some of the other athletes that showed up, and showing up was their protest. And I think about the possibilities and the potential of both sides. And so I have tremendous respect for my colleagues who use boycott as their protest, who withdraw their labor and their services as protest. And I also have respect for my colleagues that show up and use their voice as protest, because I think we're all necessary. And so I'm happy to be here. And I wanted to start by sharing an anecdote that kind of gives some sense of both how I come to the work that I do and my approach to it. So last year in June, I live in Rhode Island. I fly out of Boston Logan Airport a lot. I was flying to Madrid from Boston Logan. I was flying on Iberia Airlines. And so because Iberia is a Spanish airline, the gate agents were making announcements in Spanish and English to make sure that the main customer bases, the linguistic customers were served. To my ear, and I'll go into later, I think the positionality piece is really important. I'm going to like leapfrog it and then come back to it. But to my ear, what I heard were Caribbean varieties of Spanish, right? And to my ear, it sounded Dominican. That was the variety that I had the most experience with, going back and forth between English. There was a lot of, there was a long delay, maybe 45 minutes. So there was a lot of frustration. And so when we start to get on the plane, one of the gate agents is telling us like, sigan caminando, like keep going, sigan caminando, but no like, hey, sorry for the wait, like get on the plane. And then there was another passenger near me who had like a marked kind of centro norteño, like Spain accent, who was upset by the situation. And so she's like, sigan caminando. And he's like, yeah, sí, somos becerros, right? Like, somos becerros. And she's like, well, like, maybe if you followed instructions, I mean, she said it in Spanish, but she was like, si siguieran las indicaciones, no los trataría como becerros, right? Like, maybe if you followed instructions, I wouldn't treat you like cattle. And then it made the customer mad, as you might imagine. But what happened next was part of like what I would characterize as like the moments and the instants that inspire the questions that I explore. And so the gate agent is saying, señor, señor, like sir, sir, right? Like, can I get your attention? Like, calm down. And the man says, no soy señor, soy señor. And I was like, why would he say, I'm not a sir, I'm a sir, right? I was like, I was very confused because I was like, those are the same words, right? And it took me a split second to realize what had just happened. And so actually what the gate agent, like the way that the word had been produced, right? The phonetics of it was señor, señor, lateralizing the R to an L, right? And what the man from Spain had actually said was, no soy señor, soy señor, right? And kind of like this hypercorrection of a phonetic characteristic that was standard in the variety of Spanish that the gate agent was speaking, but was seen as defective, as deficient in the variety that the other passenger was speaking. And so like, obviously, like you could come to your own conclusions about what was happening in this space, but fortunately I did not have to, because then the customer continued. And he said, inútiles, useless, ni saben hablar, they don't even know how to speak, que hablen inglés mejor. Like, they should just speak English instead. And so I thought about like what had happened in that moment, because even though he wasn't talking to me, his words hit me, because I spoke the same variety of Spanish as the people that he was criticizing. I hadn't even noticed in the initial exchange that there was any difference in what the two speakers were saying. And I was on my way to Spain, the same place where this man was from, and it made me hyper aware and hyper conscious of the way that I was going to show up linguistically in this space, because I was reminded that it was not safe to speak Black varieties of language, especially when you are inhabiting a Black body. And so, I mean, it's not something that I'm proud of, but it's part of my actual continuing process of learning and unlearning, that on that particular trip, like every R was an R, right? Like very, very markedly so, because something that's been consistent in my journey, both as a scholar and just as an individual, is this idea of my relationship to markedness and my aversion, right, to inhabiting markedness in spaces where I was a conspicuous minority. And so, leapfrogging back, most of the research that I do, sorry, parenthetically too, I'll say that, so Aris, when you were talking about like most Black scholars who show up as Black scholars don't have a choice but to show up as Black scholars, because like it's the way the world sees you, it's the way you're going to be positioned. Now, your perspective, your ideology, like we were talking about, obviously could vary, but you are not given the choice to be Black, right? It's something that is assumed, presumed, taken for granted as you're moving through the world. And so I came to Spanish through elective, like language study. I'm also from the Bay Area, but like I left when I was like 6, so I don't know how long I can claim that. But I lived in Pleasanton. And so Pleasanton, at the time that I lived there in the 1980s, was a very conspicuously white, like 91.67% white suburb about 20 minutes outside of Oakland. And so my mother is from San Diego in Southern California and grew up there in the 50s, 60s, 70s. My father is from Northeastern Louisiana. He was born in 1949. And so thinking about that period in time and how it shaped the way he moved through the world, the way that he saw the world, his educational experience, and also his experience and ideologies about language. Because when I stepped into Spanish, and I think about like Mary Buckles' point here, who was one of my dissertation committee members, so I was like, shout out. But her point that when you step into a language, you step into a world of beliefs about that language and about language users. And so even before I stepped into Spanish and into the world of beliefs about Spanish speakers and Spanish itself, I was inhabiting English and navigating that world of beliefs about English and Englishes and people who spoke it. And so my first lessons about language happened in my house. They didn't happen in the classroom. And so I was taught ideas about correctness. Like correctness was something that was privileged in my household. And with like hindsight, I understand why, because a lot of what has been my foundational ideologies, my motivating logics have had to do with appropriateness, and they've had to do with respectability. And so I think about like the fact that my father grew up in Louisiana, Jim Crow, Louisiana in the 1940s and the 1950s, surviving as a Black person, literally physically surviving, required a certain degree of assimilation, a certain degree of appropriateness, a certain degree of respectability. And that was something that he passed on to us, even though we weren't growing up at the same time or in the same place. And so in my house, my mother and her California English were positioned as the appropriate ways to speak, the acceptable ways to speak. And my father, although I had some tension between authenticity and correctness, because I remember going to my father when I wanted something that was authentically Black. Like I saw him as an expert, as having expertise on like what's authentically Black. Whereas my mother, I saw as having the expertise on what would be academically acceptable and what would be appropriate. And so as I moved through the world pre-Spanish, I think about like my pre-Spanish and post-Spanish, or pre-Spanish and mid-Spanish, those ideologies from English, I already carried about what the consequences could be of sounding Black in spaces that don't value Blackness. I knew that in English. And so when I came into Spanish, I also knew, and it's being reinforced by interactions like these at the Boston airport, I knew what the consequences of sounding Black can be in spaces where Blackness is not valued, and in spaces where Blackness is seen as mutually exclusive from correctness, right? Or whatever would be seen as standard and sufficient. And so when I stepped into Spanish, I will say, this is me, I'm moving through time, and I'll try to make sure that I'm putting you back in the right places. But when I stepped into linguistics, I'll go there. I came to linguistics as a second act. And so in undergrad, I majored in finance and English professional writing. I minored in Spanish by studying abroad, and I minored in management, but I was going to law school. So I was like, language was fun for me. It was a hobby for me. It wasn't kind of like a lens for me to understand the world. I can see it now, like how all of these different pieces fell into place. But when I came to linguistics, I thought I was coming as a blank slate. And I think that also influences the way that I initially kind of tiptoed into the questions that I would be exploring and the ways that I would structure them. So going back to undergrad, in undergrad, I went to a historically Black college in Alabama. That's where I studied. I got my minor in Spanish. And I was thinking about too, Arthur, when you were speaking about like the Black schools and the white schools and what the classrooms looked like. And something that I had to come to understand later when I returned to my alma mater to teach Spanish was that our language classrooms were hegemonically white, right? And so even though we had Black professors and we had a largely Black student base, we were using textbooks that didn't show any diversity. And so Aris, I think about the project that you and Uju and some of your colleagues did about a task-based first-year Spanish language curriculum that celebrated Blackness and centered Black learners, because I was still at my HBCU when I learned about that project. And it was one of the moments I was already starting to think like, hey, what are we doing here? Why are we teaching people in a way that seems like they don't belong in this conversation and people like them don't speak this language? And so seeing that project, I think, opened my eyes to the possibilities. I have a colleague here who will consistently say, like, I'm a colonized subject, right? And so I was like, por más que, as much as I want, like, I am working towards liberation, I am constantly trying to do the work and to question myself. Every day, I'm still learning about the ways that I am colonized, because I was not informed of the fact that this was colonization when it was happening, and it became so normalized and it became so naturalized that I didn't question whether things could be different. And so as someone who is interested in breaking kind of like those colonial patterns and cycles, the hardest work that I've had to do is the work that excavates all the colonial ideologies that I still carry inside of me, right? Because like I'm just like every day. And so part of the reason why I enjoy being in a setting like this with people, like I said, who inspire me both from the quality of their work, but also with the boldness and kind of the critical eye and the critical lens and the critical perspective, is because it inspires me to push further, to keep going, because like this is the work of a lifetime, right? And so another thing that I wanted to share, so when I stepped into grad school in linguistics, having never studied linguistics in my life, I was like, okay, I'm a blank slate. I'm here to learn what you're here to tell me, right? And so I'm taking a lot of classes. Some are from our colleagues who are doing similar types of work in sociocultural linguistics and linguistic anthropology, but some of the classes were from other people who were teaching that version of ostensibly objective linguistic analysis that had a lot of silences and had a lot of gaps. And so I was open to receiving the story that they would tell me. And so just a few minutes before the panel started, I was showing one of my colleagues a book that I think I put back on my bookshelf, and it's called Black Women Writers at Work. And so it's a conversation, interviews with like Audre Lorde and Toni Cade Bambara and Alexis DeVoe. And I remember one of the quotes from Alexis DeVoe says, "We must be careful not to swallow everything we're fed." And And I read that now, but I did not read that before I started grad school. And so I was feeding on, I was consuming everything I was fed. And I wasn't critically questioning it because I had been taught that in order to be correct, you have to conform with whatever the rules are. And I was exceptionally good at conforming to the rules, whether that was language rules, classroom rules, etc. And when I first stepped into the classroom as a graduate student, I had the same perspective. I was like, hey, these are the rules. You need to learn them and you need to do them, and you need to do them well to get the grades that you want. And so I had a very prescriptive perspective. And I think that prescriptiveness came from the way that I was educated, both at home and in the classroom. And so I think my research, like if I think about my dissertation, for example, to things that I'm publishing today, that journey also reflects kind of the personal journey that I'm on, about how much of my positionality to include in the research. Part of my early struggle, one of my early struggles was thinking through this idea of objectivity and subjectivity, and thinking that admitting or revealing my subjectivities, that idea of transparency that you're talking about, Aris, the idea that admitting my subjectivities would somehow undermine or delegitimize my work, because my subjectivities as a Black woman would reveal me as being less than the standard, which was not Black and was not woman, right? And so that's something that I've been trying to work on, how to reclaim, right, those epistemologies, like what gives me the authority to do the research and the work that I'm doing. And so Black feminist thought has been one of the ways that has helped to shape and affirm the idea, the same ideas that we're talking about, that objectivity doesn't exist, right? And in fact, even if it were to exist, the fact that I have a subjective experience with something and I'm not objective, it doesn't undermine my authority. It actually bolsters it, because I know what I'm talking about because I've lived it, right? And so I think one of my most recent explorations for an edited volume on kind of like language education and study abroad type things, I did an autoethnographic exploration of being and becoming a Black Spanish speaker. And one of the things, it's one of the first times that I've shared this much of my personal experience with Spanish and story with Spanish. And in some ways it felt cathartic, right? And in some ways it felt like liberation, because I had always been, there had been some degree of fear of the vulnerability that would accompany kind of like exposing myself through those subjectivities. And now as I'm moving forward, like thinking about taking that first step as being necessary, sometimes terrifying, but necessary, thinking about the ways that I can continue to show up for myself in my own personal journey and trying to decolonize my mind, right, and my scholarship, et cetera, but also thinking about the ways that this will require me to show up in the classroom for my students. And so before the semester started, I was listening to the audiobook of Teaching to Transgress by Bell Hooks. And that was one of the spaces where I started considering, or continued the consideration of, how my own personal ideologies made their way into the classroom in the ways that I interacted with students, and thinking about how classrooms should be a space of liberation versus a space of continued oppression, and trying to question whether my policies are power-based. Like, am I asking students to do these things as an exercise of my own power and authority over them? Or am I asking them to do them because these things are necessary for their ultimate liberation and for their learning, like in our classroom? And I didn't, at no point in my life did I experience a classroom as a space of liberation. So it was something that felt very new to me, even though I had attended a historically Black college. I like to say, like, they taught us to contest, like identify and speak out against oppression everywhere but in the classroom. So they were like, you know, march to City Hall, like, go out and protest, but don't talk back to your teachers because there's still that authority, right? And then in language classrooms, we replicated those same ideologies. And so I guess part of the main point that I'm communicating is, like, in terms of centering Blackness in my work, in my classroom, in my teaching, I'm a work in progress, continually seeking to identify the parts of myself that are complicit with these colonial ideologies, with anti-Blackness, with white supremacy, because in many ways, I think of myself, like the education that I received, as being constructed as a monument that embeds anti-Blackness, white supremacy. And so I'm every day, like in every research project and every lesson plan, trying to chip away at like the stones that created like this monument that reinforced all of these harmful ideologies. And I'm going to stop here to make sure we have time for Juan to speak. But I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm very, very inspired by the conversation and very happy to be a part of the dialogue.
Okay, so it's my turn, and I'm happy to be here. I was reluctant at first, and I'll tell you why. But I'm happy to have had this opportunity to listen to the three of you share your experiences and your perspectives. I'm always happy to talk to students of color. So I was hoping that this would be an opportunity just to have a few minutes to share, I guess, a little bit of my perspective in this discussion of centering Blackness. But I was reluctant primarily because I'm not in academia. I don't think I'm in academia. Even when I was in it, I was always with one foot in and one foot out. But specifically, I divorced myself from sociolinguistics and academic scholarship to a degree. Primarily, these institutions and I rejected each other. I think it's one of the main points I want to make, that without people of color in positions of leadership, nothing is going to change, or not much is going to change. Institutions create institutional cultures. They are, and by the way, I really appreciate Aris for reminding us that we need to start from a position of transparency. So I'm basically, it's within that framework that I want to talk about for just a few minutes about institutions and our relationships with them. Yeah, institutions are inherently conservative and reactionary organisms, entities, and they are not transformative, they are transactional. And most of the people that are successful within institutions learn how to become transactionalists. And if one doesn't adapt to the demands of institutions, then of course, one will not have a place in those institutions. I think institutions make us prisoners of certain practices. So I was like immediately rejected, I think, by a lot of these institutions, even though, you know, I got some opportunities to teach many different universities across the country. And I was considered for, you know, the possibility of tenure, and I was in tenure track positions. But I could never fit in because of many different reasons. I, like Eva, I have an aversion to markedness, specifically to being defined. And I could not adapt to the process of becoming an institutionalist. On the other hand, there was my own role in it, and the choices and the preferences that I made as an individual. I seek freedom and love. I love my body, to start there, and I love my mind, and I want both of them to be healthy and satisfied. Institutions do not love one back. And I want to be loved, so there was an impasse between me, the work that I could do in a lot of those institutions. On the other hand, I don't know when I became an independent thinker, critical independent thinker. Independent thinkers aren't desirable for institutions. So it was pretty clear. Well, maybe it wasn't always clear, but at one point it became clear that there was no love lost between me and the institutions, so a divorce was necessary. And it's been a while. You may wonder, so what are you doing? Yes, I am teaching at Institution of Higher Learning, which I don't care to name because it's irrelevant to my practice. And I don't want that to define me or define any other things that I do. I love teaching, and at the place where I'm at, I am really happy that I am getting sufficient support, I would say. And I've been able to teach some courses that I wasn't allowed to teach before, courses such as borders and migration, the political history of discourse in Iberian America, and teaching those courses at this recent times have really allowed me to see some of the wonderful things that one can do and achieve in the classroom. Just the idea of having students complete an assignment which requires them to find borders and cross them. Those opportunities, which I think I have created for myself as a result of the choices I made in my career, have been very wonderful, reaffirming experiences of the kind of practice as a teacher that I want to make happen. The reason why I'm able to do that right now is because I liberated myself from striving toward those career goals of academics. And it's like, reaffirmed for me every day when I walk around heading to my classrooms and I listen to conversations of two professors talking about how they cannot do certain things because they are working so hard to become a full professor. While I am, heading to my classroom thinking about the great, wonderful things that we are going to do today. So I really appreciate the choices that, allow me to get to this point. To center Blackness in a world that is, hostile or at best indifferent to Blackness, I think one has to make the decision not to be complicit in your own exploitation and, in some cases, destruction. I wrote a list of things that I think I would like to share with you regarding this particular point of centering Blackness by not being complicit with institutions. Don't engage or collaborate with micro practices of hyper-privileging a certain group or population of professional scholars or educators. There are some wonderful Black intellectuals, Latino intellectuals, whose quality is undeniable, that have been packaged into this culture of superstars that we have. And that has happened at the expense of a considerable number of very capable intellectuals who just have a very low profile. And by the way, Virginia Dominguez, an anthropologist at Illinois Barnett Champaign, has talked about this superstar system and our role in creating that, and the implication that while you create this superstar system of academics, to which a lot of people aspires to, because they feel that that will free them to finally do the work that they want to do. It creates another subclass of academics who, in this process of continuous difference making or differentialization, will create this subclass who will do basically the heaviest, most difficult work. And those, if you think about it, those are perhaps academics who are considered they're good enough for the minor leagues, or maybe too good for the minor leagues, but not good enough for the major leagues. And it makes us really lose our best qualities and our focus on what really matters in terms of what one has to do in the classroom or in scholarship. I don't want to go into too many details about what my particular experience has been. If you're curious, if you allow me for some cross promotion here, my book, Sendas Extraviadas, will be coming out this year. And that book is about this, it's a personal account about my divorce from academia, but it's also a celebration of life. It's a celebration of many things, including the healing power of nature. And I do want to say, though, that there's a lot to say for focusing on the kind of work that you can do and the alternative ways of being productive and being a resource for students, for colleagues who work in different places, different parts of the world. When you are able to focus on being grounded and centered on what matters most. Among the many things that are happening right now, and among the many horrible things that are happening in the world, and everything that is going on around our daily lives, our work, and I think only if you are grounded enough in the present can you stop to look around you and see who is looking for you or who needs your attention at this moment. And I just want to give you a concrete example of what that means. Yesterday, after teaching my last class, I had to come back home. I have a 30-mile commute from work to home. And in order to beat the traffic, I have to ride my bicycle from where my classroom building is to where I park, and then start my commute. Leaving the main quad, there was a student waving at me, and I think, oh, she's just waving hi. So I wave hi back, and she calls out my name, and then I see her turn and like run towards the direction which I'm going. Oh, she wants to talk to me. So I stopped and pulled up to the side and waited for her. And she wanted to share with me what this strange encounter that she just had with a professor who is white. This student is a student of color that I had previously in my class. And she was having her dinner at one of the cafeterias on campus. And this professor sat down at her table and without really asking if it was okay for him to sit there. And then just started telling her who he was, the kind of work that he has done, like how much money he has donated to all these causes, and then proceeded to ask her like where she was from. This is a student who was born here in the Bay Area, and who, it's also resisting markedness. She goes, I am from here. And then he proceeded to ask her, no, but where are you really from? Where are you from? And then this happened for like 10 minutes. This really shocked her. And then she went through like the whole week wanting to talk to somebody about it. And then she said, but I went to a high school where there weren't hardly any white people. It was Black, it was Asian, and I'm here, and it's like mostly surrounded by white people. And you are only like one of 2 professors of color that I've had. So I wanted to make sure I talked to you first about this strange experience. And so I listened to her and try to reassure her that yes, she did the right thing by not subjecting herself to this inquiry from this professor, and then told her that if she wanted to continue to talk to me further or talk to other people about it, that I would support her in that endeavor. But the point of this was that without my groundedness on what I am doing, being present in the moment and remembering my role and responsibility to helping students, it wouldn't have happened. So I think, and I'll wrap it up by saying that in a nutshell, to center Blackness in a world that is either hostile or indifferent to it, I think one has to embrace resisting, fighting for better conditions and meaningful work. I think it's very important to look at power and privilege in the face and laugh and say, I don't care. Focus on what you do best, and live your best, most practical, actionable, and beautiful dreams. Be honest about what's at stake, the cost, the sacrifices, your role and limitations in the struggle. There's life and real work on the other side of all that striving that we do. I think that for the students of colors that are considering a career in academia here, there's lots to say for not following the conventional or most advertised career path. It is in fact liberating. It frees you up to do some amazing things. I think that it behooves us all to abandon all hope of this brilliant career and optimal results, because the struggle is real and is not pretty. But don't abandon all hope. Keep the hope of preserving the best version of yourself. And that is how I center my Blackness in my practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan. And thanks to all of you for sharing your reflections, for sharing more about your work and how you enter this conversation, as well as the vulnerability communicated through your personal anecdotes. I'm sure that questions have been percolating through the minds of our audience. So in the interest of preserving time for audience participation, we will now pivot to the Q&A. Some of you have already posted questions that you would like vocalized to the panelists. You have the option of either unmuting yourself to give voice to your question, or you can post it in the chat and Denise and I can share them for you. I will begin with Sylvia's question. The chat, I need to scroll back a little bit to find it. Okay, so this question from Sylvia Rivera Alfaro is for Arthur. How do you think this knowledge was hidden during this time? And Sylvia, if you want to offer more context, I welcome you to unmute yourself or enter in the chat.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for this amazing information, presentations, and points of views that you share with us from a perspective of how you have lived. And I don't want to say in the academia, let's say despite the academia, and in spite of whatever happens in the academia and how much it's hard to be there for different communities, and especially for people of color or racialized in different ways. So my question was about the knowledge that that Dr. Arthur was mentioning on how the Black school operated before, and then that this was lost or kind of lost, hidden. I don't know what happened with the knowledge or where it went. So I would like for him to tell us more about how he think that happened, that this knowledge was like that, operating like that, and then it got kind of lost, despite that, in theory, like some positive changes, like I thought it would be like bringing these practices, like to spread the practices, but instead, as you mentioned, they kind of disappeared. Like Black schools teaching languages and how they taught all the subjects.
Okay, so let me state what you asked in a different way to make sure I understand. I believe what you're focusing on is the knowledges for teaching that were employed in the Black schools and what happened to the knowledge behind those pedagogies. Am I on track?
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay, I just want to make sure. A great question. You know, sometimes I wonder whether I'm misremembering things. For example, could everybody hold a conversation in Spanish after 2 months in Spanish 1 in the high school that I attended? Yes, they did. And I was just talking to a friend from high school the other day. Yes, we did. He brought up an anecdote. there was a method. Our professor followed what was called the Cleveland method, which was oral. I don't know whatever happened to it. He told us what he was doing. But the Cleveland method for him was just an outline. The oral was just that you had to hear and you had to speak too. He filled in so many gaps and so many spaces between the lines of the curriculum that was the Cleveland method. He blackened the instruction. He personalized it. There was just so much going on. I wish I could talk about it more time, but it was a Black cultural and language focused pedagogy. Okay, and he brought all of that to the Cleveland method. He also brought Black discipline, which is part of Black culture. In other words, you remember I said we had no choice other than to speak the language. If you came unprepared and couldn't do your dialogue the day you were scheduled to do your dialogue, you got talked about. And then your brother was talked about, and then your sister. And then something was said about your mother, because she had been a student, and so on and so forth. And they knew how to manipulate the language to get exactly the effect they wanted. So there was an element of fear. But more importantly, there was discipline. What happened to that? And I'll say something as briefly as I can. Some of the younger kids in my extended family are in fancy private schools here in New York City. Some of them, I heard the other day, cost $90,000 a year. How on earth can a school cost $90,000 a year? They're there on scholarship, and they take French. They still don't speak it. They've been studying French since, what, the second grade? And they don't speak it. So I started tutoring them, but it didn't work for various reasons, schedules and whatnot. And I said, I cannot believe a school is charging all of this tuition and they don't produce French speakers and Spanish speakers and so on and so forth. I mean, we spoke it when we were growing up, when we got to high school and we started the courses. I think, let me lay out in a few words my ideas on education. What's going on in education is not a fluke. I think it's very planned because it suits certain end goals so well. It has to be part of a policy that was laid out. I talked to high school teachers that are friends in public high schools, and I cannot wrap my head around on what they call teaching. Do the students learn anything? My friends who are teachers say no. The principals that I know say no. But the classrooms are fairly well managed. In other words, there's no violence. There's no bouncing off the walls. So I said, are you saying that the goal is decorum rather than learning? And they say, well, I don't want to put it that way, but that's what happens. Here's what I say, and I tell my students, I told them when I was teaching. Here's the bottom line. This is the bottom line. We know how to teach biology, French, Spanish, algebra. We know how to teach it. The knowledge is there. They did it in the segregated Black schools. I know they did because I was there and I saw the results. So why are kids going K through 12 and they're not learning? Does it have anything to do with the incarceration system? Does it have anything to do with the maintenance of a pariah group, which is what all state societies do? To answer your question in the shortest way possible, those knowledges are still there, but they're locked up in a box, and they're only for certain students in certain groups. I could go on to say something about foreign languages. I believe that the situation now, the private schools and the other private schools beside the ones my relatives go to are just the same. There's an issue with teaching foreign languages in this country. There's an issue. And I wonder if you guys have thought the same thing. It used to be much better 40, 50 years ago. This country has an issue with teaching foreign languages. Just the other day, and I'm going to end with this, I was looking for some information on racism in Arab countries. And I couldn't find anything useful. And then I said, well, let me try the French stuff. So I did an online search in French. A whole bunch of stuff came up. It was very interesting. They talked about racism in Gaza and in Palestinian areas in Israel also. And of course, also Israeli issues. I used to read Le Monde, I remembered. And why did I read it so regularly? Not because I wanted to keep my French up, but there was so much that would be explained in Le Monde that I could not find explained in any of the main US media. So what am I going to say? I think this country has a problem with foreign language instruction that is effective. I know the methods are there to teach, and the country was much more interested in teaching foreign languages a while back, decades ago. And something's going on, and I think I know what it is. The foreign languages are being sidetracked. And of course, they're being cut out all over the place. Okay. This is not happenstance. It fits in with a policy world that we're enveloped in this country. Now, the next thing I would talk about, if I didn't want to give everybody else a chance to talk, is censorship and self-censorship. But I don't want to get into that, so I'll leave it there. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Arthur. And I want to name that we are past 7 o'clock, and we want to be respectful of everyone's time. So if you need to log off, we invite you to do so. If you're able to spare a few extra minutes, we plan to close the session promptly at 7:10, which gives us time for at least 1 or 2 more questions. But I especially want to be respectful of the panelists. You're giving of your time here, and we don't want to overextend that generosity. Jose, I think you had shared that you wanted to ask a question.
Yes. First of all, I want to say how privileged I feel to have had the opportunity to listen to the four of you. You're brilliant, but I already knew that before you started speaking, and you really made me uncomfortable. And that is the first thing that, as an intellectual, I want to feel. I want to be made to feel uncomfortable. Reading Edward Said's the representation of the intellectual has had a great impact on me. I think he refers to that notion to which I refer as discomfort as exile, right? It's one of the conditions of the intellectual, exile, literal and metaphorical. And hearing your testimonies about your experiences as Black scholars is truly earth-shattering for someone like me, right? Who, as I said at the beginning, I'm fully aware of the privileges I enjoy as a white male, originally from Europe. Now, all of your presentations were in a variety of ways truly informative. And disruptive, and deeply disruptive. Of course, Eva, your anecdote about the Spanish racist on the plane made me uncomfortable, right? I felt this thing as you were telling it. And Juan, your brilliant critique of the academic institution also made me feel deeply uncomfortable. I'm a university man. You know me very well, and you know that I went straight from a public elementary school, from a working class family to a public elementary school, a public high school, a public university, and then to the United States. So I'm kind of a poster boy for that. Oh, how successful was his career. And I firmly inherited from my parents this idea that institutions of education are engines for change, for social change. Right? And I was, well, when you met me, Juan, I was thrilled as a university professor. I was thrilled to have folks like you working with me, collaborating with me. And the past few years have been terrible because I have felt deeply disappointed by the university as an institution, to the point that I am in the process, my colleagues know this and my students know this too, I'm going to retire as soon as I can. Right? So I wanted to invite the rest of you, Aris, Eva, Arthur as well, whatever. What's your take on Juan's brilliant assault on the institution as a prison house, which breaks my heart, but I so much agree with him.
I have something to say, but I want to let the others speak.
Yes. I can jump in here too as a junior scholar, as somebody who is fairly new in this institution, but as somebody who has instituted what I call check-ins, quarterly check-ins are what they call, and these are questions that I ask myself. And those questions usually are, it's kind of very regimented. Do you feel safe? Are you able to do what you need to do? Do you want to be where you are? And is this serving you and the people you want to serve in this moment? I ask myself that every 3 months. I sit down, I take a day, I put it on my calendar, and I ask myself those questions. Am I able to do what I need to do to support the students that I want to support the communities and the logics and the narratives and the stories that I want to support in this current position? And I have already made the decision that as soon as any of those answers are no, then I will find other ways to do it. And mostly because I already have, right? So I came to this job from being a director of academics in a Catholic school in Brooklyn that I call La Hispaniola, because it was made up of basically 100% Haitians and Dominicans, but, you know, a few other West Indians probably thrown in there. And I remember in that time where students, we would have 100% of the students get into college, and they would call me for years afterwards and say, Miss, I don't belong here. I don't belong in this school. I don't belong in Mount Holyoke or Providence or all of these schools that we were getting them in. And after a while, I was like, oh, they need other people in that space that can see them. And so even when thinking of Sylvia's question about what happened to these things, there's purposeful, you know, pedagogical and curricular policies that have been made to erase the histories and the ability for people to see your students or these people, certain people in these spaces, right? And because of that, I've had students who told me, you know, I learned more when I was forced to go back to the Dominican Republic for a year, because at least those teachers believed I could learn, right? And so the actual idea of just being able to see somebody as a full human, and to the privilege that I get to be in the position to see students who are not often seen as fully human and capable of dreams and desires and the ability to learn, is something that is allowing me to stay in the institution, despite the fact that we already know that it exists as a particular machine, right? And so to understand the duality, that two things can be true at the same time, that one thing can be destructive and allow you the space and the privilege to build people up and to allow people to understand ways and pathways towards liberation, is how I'm able to stay in the space. Both things at the same time, continuously checking in on myself.
Thank you, Aris. And I am now faced with the very difficult task of ending this session. This has been such a provocative conversation. I want to extend my heartfelt gratitude, both on behalf of Denise and myself, to Aris, Arthur, Eva, and Juan for the invaluable insights and contributions to our exploration of centering Blackness in Hispanic sociolinguistics. Today, we've delved into critical questions surrounding the intersections of language, race, and identity, and the urgent need for our discipline to actively combat racism and repression within academia and beyond. Your multifaceted perspectives have illuminated pathways for transformative change, challenging us to reevaluate our practices and commitments. As we navigate these complex issues, let us carry forward the spirit of this discussion, fostering inclusivity, amplifying marginalized voices, and working towards a more just and equitable future. Thank you all for being a part of this vital conversation. I look forward to continuing this conversation. We look forward to it. Denise, but before we end, is there anything you want to add?
No,
I'd
you.
like to make a request, and it's, would you make a list of the references in the chat, and also Juan's book that is coming out, so we'll have it?
Yes, Juan, would you mind saying the name of the book one more time?
Sendas extraviadas.
Perdón? Oh, you're muted, Juan.
Sendas extraviadas, ensayos para vivir en el mundo que nos queda.
Ensayos para vivir en el mundo que nos queda. Okay. Yes, we will do that. Thank you for that request. And thank you all for joining us. Have a great evening and a great weekend.
Okay.
Thank you all. Super humbling and inspiring. Gracias.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Adios.